Then never come back. Sign the divorce papers before you leave. Faced with my desire to return to my parents' home, my husband hurled insults at me. Happily, I signed the divorce papers and finalized the divorce that very day. I wanted to get away from my husband that badly. After filing for divorce, I reunited with my father at my parents' home. I told him about the process of my divorce. My father listened calmly without showing any anger. Then, making a phone call, he stood up and said, "Let's go." I stood up and followed him, getting into the car. Together with my father, I went to take revenge on my ex-husband. My name is Ashley. I am a 51-year-old homemaker. I met my husband Mike during our college days, and we got married. Now, he has climbed the corporate ladder and works at a trading company, soon to be promoted to executive vice president. Our married life was never smooth sailing. Well, maybe it was for Mike. But for me, it was like living in hell. Because every day was a struggle. Mike was a man of bravado at home but had a really good public image. He was constantly praised as the ideal husband by everyone around. No one seemed to believe the true nature of Mike. It's understandable. Who would think that a person with such a respectable title could be abusive? Even I, before our marriage, didn't notice it. It was impossible for a stranger to see through him. Mike became arrogant at home, and his true nature began to show after our marriage. While we were dating, he was genuinely kind, patiently teaching me things, even when I was incompetent. He was such a considerate person. But after marriage, he became a completely different person. Taking advantage of our marriage, he started treating me as his property. "Hey, what's this awful meal?" "I'm sorry. I thought I had the taste right." Don't make excuses. Just expressing a slight opinion made Mike yell and intimidate me by making loud noises. After a while, I became scared to even voice my opinion to him. If I don't fight back, it'll be fine. I convinced myself and became completely submissive to Mike. I used to have friends, so I tried contacting them for advice. But Mike found out and shut down all communication with them. Mike contacted my friends and managed to cut off my SOS calls by skillfully dodging the issue. "No one but me would bother with someone as incompetent as you. Just quietly do as I say." That's how I ended up being confined in a home that felt like a prison. Any attempt to act was immediately thwarted, and I couldn't seek help from neighbors, let alone friends. Whenever I tried, I was threatened. "Do you understand? Who do you think you are living off? If you leave me, how will you survive? Having no one to turn to?" But even with those words, I had no way to respond. Mike was right, I had no one to rely on. My mother had passed away, and my father was alive but not someone I could easily turn to. To be precise, I didn't even know where my father was. When I was young, he left my mother and me and went away. I lacked the financial means to live on my own and had no one to rely on. Eventually, I started to think that maybe escaping this situation was impossible. That's the thought that began to consume me. But then, an incident pushed me to my limits. Mike took out his frustration on me after losing in gambling. This unreasonable behavior finally brought me to my breaking point, and I decided to tell him I wanted to go back to my parents' house, where my late mother had lived. "Please, I just want to go back for a little while. I just want to pay respects at my mother's grave." Honestly, I just wanted to get away from Mike for a bit. But I couldn't tell him that truthfully. It's not that I didn't want to pay respects to my mother, but more than anything, I wanted to get out of that house. That was my sole focus. No way. Why would you want to visit someone who's already gone? She's not even there. Stop with this superstitious thinking. There's no need for you to go. Mike said, not even looking at me while reading his financial newspaper. His response left me speechless. He didn't even treat me like a person anymore. I began to think that perhaps it was impossible to continue with him. That was my realization. Then, something snapped inside me. Understood. I replied coldly to Mike's statement, which seemed to irritate him. He frowned and turned his gaze from the newspaper to me. What was that tone? Do you think it's okay to speak to me like that? I don't care. I no longer think of you as a person. What did you say? At that point, I didn't care what he did to me. Whatever happened to me didn't matter anymore. If it meant I could go to my mother, that was fine. I must have been prepared to end everything. That's why, with newfound courage, I faced Mike's menacing approach without flinching and stared him down. Inside, I was terrified. It was almost my first act of defiance. It's natural to instinctively fear someone whose actions are unpredictable. But I wouldn't lose. I was determined never to be under Mike's control again. I will be going back to my parents' house. I met Mike's glaring eyes without looking away, maintaining a straight and steady gaze. I acted bravely, determined not to let him see my fear. Mike was infuriated. He slammed the financial newspaper on the table and pulled out a sheet of paper from a shelf containing his work documents. Then never come back. Sign the divorce papers before you leave. He shouted, revealing his anger, and thrust the divorce papers at me. He probably thought I would panic. But that was far from the case. In fact, it was a moment of joy. I was so happy inside that I almost jumped for joy. But I couldn't let him realize that. This was the moment I had longed for. Finally, I would be free. Keeping a poker face, I simply said, "Understood." Then, taking the divorce papers, I immediately signed them and insisted that Mike sign as well. Mike was taken aback by this turn of events, visibly unsettled. He probably thought I would desperately cling to him and beg if he handed me the divorce papers. But that didn't happen. It was the turn of events I had been waiting for. There was no way I would regret this choice. I was jubilant. Thus, our marriage came to an end, and the divorce was finalized that day. Immediately after the divorce papers were processed, I flew back to my parents' home. The house, which had become desolate since my mother's passing, was dusty and in a state too harsh for living. It's going to be hard to get this place in order today. I sighed, standing in front of the house, when suddenly I heard the sound of luggage dropping behind me. "Oh, are you alive?" Turning around, I saw a gentleman in a white-haired suit standing there. I recognized the figure and began to dig through my memories. But the old man, unconcerned with my confusion, hugged me and wept, saying he had missed me. "I'm so glad. I received news of your death and couldn't stay put. I finally found you. I've always wanted to see you. I'm truly sorry for not being there for you back then." The old man, crying and continuously apologizing while mistaking me for someone else. The strength of his embrace was strong, as if he was confirming my very existence. And with his warmth, memories from my childhood resurfaced. Could it be Dad? My statement must have surprised him. The old man jerked slightly and slowly pulled away from me. Then, with tears still on his cheeks, he stared intently at my face. "Could it be, are you Ashley?" The old man muttered, looking over my face and body, as if confirming his thoughts. I didn't remember his voice or face, but the sensation of his embrace and his scent. Instinctively, I realized he was my real father, Brian. "It is you. Dad, I've always wanted to see you." The moment I recognized him as my real father, I hugged him again. I had only known his name all this time, not knowing his whereabouts. My mother had firmly refused to tell me his surname, making it impossible to find any clues about my father. "Ashley. I'm glad you're well." My father, who realized I wasn't my mother, was momentarily unsettled but then embraced me back, accepting me. "Somewhat. I'm relieved to see you looking well, too, Dad. I'm sorry. I left you and your mother, and During the war, my father, the heir to a wealthy family, had eloped with my mother and raised me. They had managed to escape to a remote countryside unknown to anyone, but my father, due to his status, was eventually taken back home by my grandparents before I was old enough to remember. Mom always cared about you, Dad." "Really?" When I was young, I once asked my mother, "Mom, don't you hate Dad?" "Why would you say that?" "Because he left you and went away. Leaving Mom behind, that's sad." As I spoke, puffing my cheeks, my mother gently stroked my head and smiled. "Ashley, I'm not alone." "What do you mean? Dad gave me you, didn't he?" It's not Dad's fault. If there's someone to blame, maybe it's the times. While looking at the garden from the porch, my mother smiled sadly. If it were nowadays, we might still be together. That's what I believe. So, Ashley, if I can meet Dad in the next life, I want to be with him properly as husband and wife. My mother smiled shyly as she said this. Even as a child, I was touched by how deeply my mother loved my father and still thought of only him. When I told my father this, he collapsed on the spot, rubbing his head on the ground and crying. Me too. I've always wanted to see you again, Dad. I gently patted his back until he finished crying. After crying until his tears and voice dried up, my father raised his head and smiled with swollen eyes. I'm sorry for showing such a pathetic sight at our long-awaited reunion. Don't worry about it. Seeing you here and Mom not showing up, she's passed away, hasn't she? My father regained his composure and surmised the situation about my mother, murmuring as if realizing something. I nodded slightly and led my father to the family altar, where we paid respects to my mother for the first time in a long time. Finally, I've come to see you. I'm back. As I prayed in front of the altar, I felt as if my mother was smiling and welcoming me back. I just felt it. As my father and I were catching up, he noticed the ring on the ring finger of my left hand. By the way, have you gotten married? I had almost forgotten about the symbol of love with Mike. The ring, which now felt more like handcuffs, made me feel disgusted, and I took it off in front of my father while answering. But I just got divorced. Divorce? Did something happen? My father asked, looking worried. I hesitated, wondering if I should tell him the truth. There was no guarantee that he would believe me. He might even take Mike's side and suggest I go back and try to mend the marriage. As these anxieties swirled inside me, my father seemed to sense them. He placed his hand on my head, as if to dispel my fears, and gently stroked it. I couldn't do much for your mother, but from now on, I want to protect you. I might be an unreliable father, but can you talk to me? I'm on your side. His warmth and kind words made tears naturally roll down my cheeks. I had no memory of such gentle words during my marriage. It's okay to lean on someone for support. Feeling as though my mother was also pushing me to rely on someone, I decided to tell my father everything about the treatment I had received from Mike. After I finished my story, my father remained silent for a while, not saying anything. Had I made a mistake by speaking up? Regretting my decision and feeling anxious, I was lost in my thoughts. Seeing me like this, my father suddenly stood up, perhaps driven by some thought. Ashley, follow me. Where are we going? Just come. Wait. Without further explanation, my father called for a ride and we both got into the taxi. I had no idea where he was taking me, but he was on the phone with someone. Hello? It's been a while. I need to talk to you about your son. I'm coming home now, can you come over? Thanks. It seemed he had invited someone to his house, but who could it be? My question was soon answered. Long time no see, Jack. It's good to see you too, Brian. And you as well, Ashley. Jack. To my surprise, my father-in-law appeared at my father's house. Why was he here? Did my father and father-in-law know each other? Confused, I watched as my father laughed awkwardly. Sorry, I was a bit irritated after hearing the story and didn't explain the situation properly. Actually, Brian and I are drinking buddies. We met through a mutual friend. I knew he had a daughter, but I never imagined it was Ashley. Both my jovial father-in-law and gentlemanly father laughed heartily. I never imagined these two very different men could be such good friends. Who could have predicted this turn of events? I stared at them in disbelief. Noticing my look, my father cleared his throat. I called Jack here because I wanted to talk about your ex-husband, his son. Something about Mike? What happened, Ashley? Clearly, my father-in-law was unaware of the situation. My father-in-law's eyes sparkled with curiosity as he looked at me, seemingly puzzled. It was difficult to tell him about the divorce, as both he and my mother-in-law were very kind people. But with the support of my father and late mother, I gathered my courage and told them everything. My father-in-law listened quietly until I finished, but then his expression darkened with anger. Did my son really do such things? He asked fiercely, and I stepped back a bit, nodding firmly. Hearing this, my father-in-law looked at my father, seeking confirmation. As my father nodded slowly, my father-in-law's face reddened with anger. Why didn't you consult us sooner? My father-in-law raised his voice in anger. Seeing this, I felt a pang in my heart, wondering if he didn't believe me, but the words he spoke next left me frozen. If you had. I cautiously looked at my father-in-law, wondering if I had misunderstood his words. His face showed a mix of anger and guilt, and he looked at me with concern. Did we seem so unreliable to you? Did you think we would favor our son? I was honestly taken aback by his words. Was he really choosing to believe me, a virtual stranger, over his own son? Wouldn't anyone naturally favor their own child? Why would he do otherwise? My face must have shown my doubts. My father-in-law, looking downcast, spoke to me soothingly. Ever since the day Ashley joined our family as a bride, my wife and I have treated you as our daughter. There's no way we would be biased towards our son. Rely on us more. He placed his hand on my shoulder and looked at me kindly. In that moment, I realized that my father-in-law and father were truly listening to me, and tears streamed down my face uncontrollably. I was overwhelmed with relief and a sense of guilt for not speaking up earlier. I should have spoken up sooner. I should have sought help. I shouldn't have given up. I should have voiced my opinions. Realizing the importance of expressing oneself, I managed to calm down and thanked my father-in-law. Watching me, my father patted my back, and my father-in-law continued to offer comforting words. I thanked my father-in-law again, now more composed. He chuckled modestly, saying, "Oh, stop it," and the three of us were enveloped in a warm atmosphere. Well, shall we give that foolish son of mine a piece of our mind? A piece of mind? Yes. After what he's done to Ashley, he needs to apologize properly, or I won't be satisfied. And so, we decided to confront Mike. However, I didn't want any more direct involvement with him. I didn't even want to call him. Seeing this, my father spoke up, asking my father-in-law to make the call. I'll summon him here. I can't just do nothing as Ashley's father after what she's been through. I'll speak calmly, so don't worry. As if reading my mind and alleviating my concerns, my father smiled kindly at me. Jack, could you please call Mike? As soon as my father made this request, my father-in-law immediately called Mike and handed the phone to my father. Hello, nice to meet you. Ashley has always been under your care. Mike must have been suspicious, suddenly speaking to a stranger. From the other end of the phone, a doubtful voice came. Who are you? I need to talk to you about Ashley. Please come to my house immediately. Huh? Why should I bother going to some stranger's house? Even though the phone wasn't on speaker, his voice was loud. He was practically shouting. What a way to speak to someone he's never met. Mike's rudeness disgusted me. Just come. Understood? I was a little surprised. My father, usually gentle, was speaking in a firm and stern tone, unusual for him. Mike must have sensed it, too. From the other end of the phone, I could sense his hesitation. My father simply said that one sentence, then abruptly ended the call and handed the mobile phone back to my father-in-law. Shortly after, my mobile phone was bombarded with frantic calls from Mike. You don't need to answer it. We're going to see him soon anyway. Just ignore it. My father instructed, and I obediently turned off my phone. Mike probably didn't have the courage to call back after the earlier conversation. He would prefer to confront me directly, where he could be more assertive. Such tactics were typical of Mike. Understanding his thought process, I sighed in disdain, thinking how pathetic he was. After a while, Mike arrived at my father's house. Presumably, my father-in-law had sent him the location. He barged in, complaining as soon as he entered. What the heck is this all about? Why did you call me to this place? And who was that old man on the phone? Mike burst in, shouting from the moment he entered. His voice was so loud it seemed to echo in my ears, making me wince, but he didn't seem to care. Upon seeing me, he raised his voice even more. Ashley, Why didn't you answer my calls? I called you so many times, and you just hung up. Do you think you can do that to me? My father stepped in front of me protectively as Mike looked like he was about to explode his anger. What's with you, old man? Move, you're in the way. I won't move. Stop speaking to Ashley like that. Huh? It's none of your business. Don't meddle in family matters. Mike responded with an irritated tone, clicking his tongue. His attitude brought back all my traumatic memories, and I began to tremble in fear. Trying not to show my fear, I hugged myself, but my father-in-law reassured me with a gentle touch on my back. His support helped me regain some composure, and I watched my father confront Mike without flinching. Nice to meet you. I'm Ashley's father. Huh? Father? Ashley doesn't have a dad. Mike looked at my father with suspicion rather than surprise. He had assumed my father was dead since I never talked about him. His dismissive attitude made my anger rise. I am indeed her father. Would you like me to bring a family register to prove it? A quick check will confirm that Ashley is my daughter. Fine. So what was the phone call? What do I have to apologize for? My father, standing firm and unafraid to confront Mike, seemed so strong and reliable. I felt reassured by his presence. What's with your attitude, young man? Don't you have something to say to me? My father-in-law was seething with anger. My father-in-law frowned and glared at Mike, speaking with an intimidating tone. His presence emanating from his tall, imposing figure was so intense that, even though I wasn't the one being addressed, I felt like cowering. Huh, something I need to talk about. Mike looked completely scared, reeling back as if he had been confronted by a snake. What have you been doing to Ashley all this time? Nothing. I was just taking care of naive Ashley, that's all. Don't lie. Mike, in fact, was terrible at handling being scolded. People like him, who think they're always right, find it hard to be lectured by others. My father-in-law's incredulous response to Mike's absurd claim made him roar and almost shove Mike against the wall with his thunderous voice. Eek. Naive. You're the one who's utterly clueless about the real world, strutting around and bossing others. Shame on you. My father-in-law was venting all the frustration I had accumulated. Scared, Mike stumbled backwards and ended up falling onto a sofa behind him. Listen. Why do you think you're able to strut around at my company? Actually, Mike was working for my father-in-law's company. It appears that my father-in-law built the company from the ground up and Mike was treated as the successor. Your work is something any other employee could easily handle. I only promoted you to reduce Ashley's burden, thinking it would be harder for her if you didn't succeed. Shocked by the truth revealed by my father-in-law, I turned to Mike with a look of surprise. I was shocked to hear this, as Mike had always boasted to me that the company can't function without me. This was the reality. I couldn't believe I had married such a pitiful person. Watching Mike, it felt like he was shrinking before my eyes. Perhaps I was too lenient in keeping a deluded man like you in the company. Father, what are you talking about? You're fired, my father-in-law declared. Fired? Both Mike and I were shocked by this sudden announcement. At the sudden announcement of his firing, I thought it seemed like a drastic proposal. It turns out you've been embezzling company funds. I was just thinking I needed to discuss this with Ashley when all this happened. I have no obligation to overlook your foolish behavior any longer. One after another, Mike's misdeeds were being revealed. The revelation of Mike's misconduct left me in utter disbelief. Wait. I was wrong, Father. And Ashley. It was all my fault. I didn't appreciate what I had and was stubborn. Finally understanding the gravity of the situation. Mike clung to me, crying and begging for forgiveness in a pitiful state. As I looked down on him, I showed a faint, mocking smile. Could you please not address me so casually? Mike must have been surprised by my unusually cold tone. He froze completely, stopping in his tracks and just looking up at me. We are over. Could you please not address me so familiarly? I would prefer if you didn't touch me at all. Ashley, what are you saying? He must have been unable to believe my defiance. This was the first time I had reacted this way, after living in fear of Mike for so long. His shock at my response, like a pet dog being bitten back by its owner, was almost comical. Unable to contain myself, I let out a laugh. "Oh, you didn't hear me? Shall I say it again?" I leaned down next to a cowering Mike and whispered coldly in his ear. "Just the sight of you disgusts me. Please disappear from my sight." As I let out all the resentment and bitterness of the past in that one statement, I walked away from Mike. As I left him, Mike's face drained of color, looking as if he was seeing a nightmare. The following events happened quickly. Mike, like an empty shell, was taken away by my father-in-law and thoroughly reprimanded upon returning home. My father and I were astounded by the self-inflicted misfortune that awaited Mike, considering it well-deserved. Thus, I successfully avenged myself against Mike and cut ties with him. I hired a lawyer to fight for a substantial alimony in the divorce settlement. I had actually documented all the emotional abuse I suffered in a diary and handed over the audio recordings I had made for such a moment. Mike approached the lawyer, asking to settle things directly with me, but I firmly refused. I never wanted to see his face again. I made this clear through the lawyer, ensuring I would not have to face him. According to the lawyer, it was very likely that I would win the court case, which allowed me to look forward to enjoying the rest of my life. My father-in-law fired Mike for embezzlement and cut all ties with him. Mike reportedly begged for forgiveness, but he was turned away right at the door. My father-in-law did not care to listen any longer. After that, I decided to live with my father. We continued to maintain a relationship with my father-in-law's family, now closer than during my marriage. At first, I was hesitant about living with my dad. I thought it might be strange to rely on my father since I'm already an adult. But then my father suggested, "If you're okay with it, why don't you spend the rest of your life with me in your mother's house?" Agreeing to this, my father and I traveled a lot to make up for the time we couldn't spend together before. We traveled not only domestic, but also abroad. We roamed all over the country. I wanted to show my mother, who loved traveling, various beautiful landscapes. So, I always carried her photo with me on our travels.